This is an audio review of Revise Everything You Write, Chapter 3, Errors in English. Okay, so as we've talked about before, there's no such thing as good writing, right? There's only rewriting. It's essential to break out of the idea that you need to write a perfect paper from top to bottom, or that it should even be possible, right? This is fiction. You develop good writing through the process of writing, through revising, and then rewriting, until you craft the paper that's effective. So revisions are important to improve your paper. This is why I take the time to carefully read through your paper submissions and offer detailed feedback, because it's through those revisions that you can make your paper great. The revisions do not need to come from me, right? They can come from a classmate, a loved one you coerce into reading your paper, maybe a person who made you pick them up from the airport at some point, right? You got to pay them back. So have someone read it and look at what makes sense to them and what doesn't. And that helps you really improve upon weaker sections of the paper until what results is a paper that you love. Okay, so in this real brief audio, I'm going to go over the 3 kinds of revisions discussed in the 10-page chapter, right? Substitution, deletion, and addition. Okay, so first was substitution. So changing word choices is a big part of substitution. Words have specific meanings, so you have to think carefully about your word choices. So we talked before about the tone of your paper and how words can really affect this, right? So you have to think, what do I want people to take away from this paper when they read it? And is this particular wording conveying what I want it to convey? It takes a measure of reflexivity or stepping back from yourself to really read the paper like it's the first time that you're seeing it. Think about it this way. When you open the dictionary to look up a word, you see how most words have multiple meanings. So that means they make sense in different contexts. This is where it can get confusing for some people, because if the meaning you are using, that might not be the meaning interpreted by the reader, which is why I suggest being as straightforward as possible with your word choices, as to not confuse others. Another part of substitution is changing sentence structure, right? Which can help you avoid paragraph monotony, where the paper becomes repetitive, stale, and this really affects the flow and readability of the paper. Okay, moving on to deletion. So the first way to deal with deletion in your paper is to eliminate wordiness. This is the best way, in my opinion, to improve your paper. When you eliminate all the words that are unnecessary, you're left with the central points that make your arguments much more effective, because they kind of punch out at you as you read, and there's not the space left to get confused or get kind of drawn to different conclusions, right? Or really just to lose focus. So another way to improve your paper is to delete confusing sentences, or in some cases, if part of that sentence makes sense, then you can reword them to be more effective, right? Like if the core of the sentence has a purpose in your paper, you can rework or remove some of those sentences and improve the pace of your paper. So it's really a matter of trying to really ask yourself, does this matter? Does this section affect the overall context or point that I'm trying to make? And then, of course, you want to delete irrelevant sentences. This is something I try to do when revising your papers, because a lot of details make their way into early paper submissions that aren't necessary, right? And once they are removed, it's much more focused, which makes the paper clear. So this is why you'll see me cut out if you include the author's name, the article title, the journal title, the university where it was done, how many participants, blah, blah, blah. Unless those things are specifically warranted in your paper, then it often just weighs down that submission and makes it unclear what it is you're trying to say, because there's just a whole bunch of stuff to sift through, right? Okay, moving on to addition. So sometimes things have to be added to improve the paper. So sometimes this means to clarify concepts or arguments that were not fully explored or defined in your paper, right? So you need to add when ideas or concepts are not fully explained. So in some cases, this means adding an example or maybe an illustration of a concept or a theory so that it better supports your arguments or supports your arguments more effectively, right? Sometimes we pop stuff in the paper with the intent to further explain it, but by the time the deadline rolls around, we haven't really finished that section. So it's a common thing to need to explain some things in subsequent paper submissions. So when you're looking through and editing your papers and revising them, just think to yourself, does this example make sense, or, is this concept fully explored? Because again, to us it makes sense, but it might not resonate in the same way with the reader if we're not being kind of clear about what we're saying, right? Okay, so the incredibly short chapter talked about revision practice, right? So we reviewed the three kinds of revisions, right? The substitution, deletion, or addition, right? The three types of revisions that are explored in the chapter. So now you have to put them into action in your paper. So you do this when you check and recheck your word choices. With each pass of your paper, you're going to be checking these things, or with each draft, right? Take a little time to think about your word choices and if they are effective. Also, you might want to revise the word order, because sometimes the problem is the order of words, whether it be an issue of grammar, sentence structure issues, or really just using a lot of passive voice instead of a more active voice, right? Sometimes just changing the order of the words in your sentence can make a much clearer, more effective sentence. Also, altering some figures of speech. Remember, we talked about how some of these figures of speech may not be accessible to all readers. They may be regionally specific, right? Or just add some confusion or informality to your paper that can really shift the focus and affect the paper's credibility, right? So you want to kind of, if you're using those things, be mindful of why, or just have kind of that thoughtful reason as to why you're doing it, right? And then you want to remove sections that are stale or dull. Again, I mean, that seems pretty obvious, right? And it doesn't mean you remove all the concepts. It just means that you can often cut around the points you're trying to make and then try and reform an argument that can be a bit more, can just reach the reader in a more profound way. And you, again, want to examine the order of your paragraphs, whether it's the kind of structure of them in that situation we were talking about before about limiting the monotony, or it could be a matter of, let's say you start talking about a concept and then later on you talk about, you kind of introduce the theory before the concept or the concept before the theory, things like that. Sometimes just the meaning of the paper makes more sense when you think of it from the context of starting with the more kind of larger overall points and then whittling down to the more specifics, right? Which is why I really suggest in your literature review section that you have a small introductory paragraph that just says, hey, in this, well, maybe not hey, but right, it says like, in this section, I'm going to explore the factors of blank, blank, and blank, or whatever your factors are. It doesn't have to be three of them. But, that way it's clear earlier on that that's kind of what's going to be set up as the scope. Because sometimes when I'm reading through people's papers, I see stuff and I'm like, okay, I see where this concept is, but what does that have to do with anything? Because it hasn't been set up yet, or it's not explained until much later. So sometimes it's literally just, hey, if you move this paragraph up 2 paragraphs and put it in between these other paragraphs, the whole thing makes way more sense. So consider thinking about that as well, just going through and making sense of, does this kind of fit the scope of that outline I made earlier in the semester, right? For my intended way to introduce information, right? Okay, so also in the chapter, there's a lot of questions to ask of your writing. So I just think this can be very helpful before you submit your final paper draft to really go through these kind of things, right? So, when looking at your paper, does it have a central purpose? Is that something that can be identified by someone else easily, right? Or do I provide ample support for my claims? So are you just making arguments and letting them stand on their own? Or are you supporting them with research, right? Finding information that actually validates that, right? How's the paper arranged? Is it clear? Is it logical? Is it orderly? Right? Is it kind of slapped together? Right? Those are things you want to improve before the final paper submission. Is the composition unified? That's something that doesn't happen by accident. That's something that really happens through this process of revision. When you find those kind of little errors and you whittle them out until you find something that's much more kind of unified, a paper where your voice is leading it from top to bottom, and as the reader, I can keep a clear focus on what it is you're trying to say throughout. Also, is the writing clear in all areas, right? Is the material interesting? Meaning, does it appeal to readers, not just like nerds for sociology like myself, but if this is a paper you could use later on for research competitions or sociological conferences or other undergraduate research conferences, is that something people are going to be interested in, right? Are they going to want to read this? And are the grammar and mechanical details of the paper correct? All those pesky things of, right, do the sentences make sense? Is the spelling correct, right? There's no like misplaced modifiers or any of that kind of stuff. So those things matter because they do really kind of send a message about your writing, that you're prepared, that you are, a proficient, thoughtful writer when you don't have a bunch of glaring errors. I think I already told you the story earlier about how I did that with my thesis. It was terribly embarrassing and I'll remember it forever. Was in my abstract of my thesis, in the first submission I turned in, I was looking at perceptions of female presidential candidates, and I put female resident instead of president. And my advisor circled that and just put a question mark next to it. And I was devastated because, I knew what I meant. When I looked at it, it said president, but it said resident. And that's not something spell check would catch, right? But it was memorable because I was like, oh man, what does that do when within the first couple sentences of a paper, there's a mistake? It just makes you look like an idiot, right? And that's what it felt like to me. I felt like an idiot. And the rest of the long ass paper I wrote was great, but that part really, kind of communicated to him that I had not given it enough passes or enough revisions before I turned it in, or I would have seen that. Because revising, remember, you're not reading through papers at the same speed as normal when you're revising. You're being thoughtful, you're being careful, you're really slowly working through those sections to make sure that they make sense. And often, the best way to do that is to read it out loud. And if I would have noticed resident. After that, I learned that lesson. And I did that even though my paper was crazy long, I would read it out loud, or I would put it in one of those text-to-speech kind of things so that it would read it to me, so that I could find stuff like that where I'm like, wait, what? That's not what I thought it said. Because again, our brains are really good at kind of fixing the errors between what we see on the page once it hits our eyeballs and, before it hits our brains and interprets those things. So we kind of have to be really thoughtful and careful to work against how good our brain is at that stuff. Okay, simplicity. So you want to express your arguments with logic and clarity. So this is the best approach to a paper. Sometimes you just need that, kiss. Or as they say, keep it simple, stupid. So when looking at the veracity of your paper's arguments, you should be thinking in a specific way geared towards your sociological research question and your topic. So this will help it fit within the context of sociological research by focusing on the population you're studying, or the social issue, or the social aspects. So another thing to look at are the concepts defined without condescension or wordiness, which, if you've read a million peer-reviewed articles like I have, then you know that so many articles are written wordy, unclear, confusing, and often with condescension. So it's as if the author is talking down to the reader, right? Or thinks that they're super fancy because they're knowledgeable about a certain topic. We all know things. Some of us more than others these days, but we don't have to be a condescending jerk about it. I don't think anyone ever read a paper and thought it was condescending and then was like, oh, I can't wait to read more, right? That's never happened. So you want to use concepts and theories and things like that, but you don't want to make it like, I'm so great, I know what it is, right? Because that's, conveying it in a way that's clear and effective means that you can actually give this to people in a more accessible light. So something we talk about in sociology is, what is the purpose of this research, right? Are we making the research so we can pat ourselves on the back and be fancy? Be like, wow, look at all those $10 words I put in there, right? Or are we doing the research so that it can affect actual social change, right? Whether that be in a more liberal, what's it called? Kind of structural way of, creating laws or creating, mandates or, any of those kind of changes to the institutional structures that come as a result of the research that we're doing, right? So changing the law, changing, regulations, things like that to incorporate the findings of the research, right? Is that why we're doing it? Or is it to inform activism? Is it to inform communities that are struggling with certain issues so that they can, to help provide advocacy? Or, we're not just making research so we can be like, wow, there's a lot wrong with with our culture, or pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, wow, we really understand just to the extent that human suffering takes place because of, our particular topic, like let's say homelessness or something like that. When we're researching these things, it's not just about, oh, wow, look at this issue, well, I figured it out. It's about, how do we connect that to advocacy? How do we connect that to actually alleviating some of these harms, right? So, or activism. So to do that, we have to write papers that people can read even if they didn't get a PhD in sociology. And that's kind of my focus in this class, is to help you find ways to write a very structured academic paper. But again, something that is accessible, that people can read without feeling like they have to break out a dictionary to understand what's happening, right? Or had to have had several sociology classes to understand what the wording is. So that's why when you bring in concepts, you have to define them or give them a little scope so that, someone that maybe they just haven't come across that concept, even if they are a sociologist, will understand where you're coming from. And if they are a sociologist who's read a bunch about that discipline, then they'll know what specific definition or focus you're using. Okay, so when it comes to vocabulary, vocab is obviously very important to meaning, right? But it's also important for clarity and for flow or readability of your paper. So you don't need to use a bunch of fancy $10 words to convey your points. Oftentimes the best way is to be direct. Okay, conversational quality. So what is the meaning of conversational quality? This is something that you read and it makes sense or it clicks to you. So I'm a nerd and I also have like 1,000 jobs. Well, really, actually, it's 4 jobs at this moment, but it feels like 1,000 sometimes. So anyway, one of my jobs is a teen librarian, and I work with teens and I order young adult books and graphic novels, which means that I read a lot of them as well. So some books, I open it up, and within a day, I've decimated it. And others I hang on to for weeks, slowly trudging through them. I like some dense stuff though too, because I'm a sociologist, right? I like to read theory. I like people like Chomsky and Foucault, right? That you read them and you have to reread and be like, wait, what are they saying? But then some of my favorite writers are someone like John Green or James Baldwin, Rainbow Rowell or Maya Angelou, or, like Neil Gaiman, Audre Lorde, or maybe Alan Moore, right? There's many others, but those are the first that come to mind because they all write in such a way that you feel like someone's just talking to you. And you're right there with them, right? And way too quickly, the book is over. So it's someone talking to you or telling you a story or arguing for why an issue isn't important. So conversational quality does not mean sloppy writing or super informal writing. It means you hear the author's voice leading the paper while you're reading it. So the ease of expression is what makes it seem like someone's talking to you as you read. And, as the author, if you're able to make your papers effective in this way, right, by getting the right wording, revising it down the correct way, then the reader is thinking with you as you move through your points in the paper, and you use the research to demonstrate your arguments. So individuality is a big part of papers as well, even though, oftentimes we talk about objectivity. None of us are objective, right? We do have subjectivity in the way that we write, in the words that we use, and in the approaches that we take, right? So individuality implies subjectivity because in your paper, you're applying your own standards and judgments while you're writing. So it's really about finding the right balance of your voice and the research to explain or validate your points in the literature review section of your paper. A highly subjective writer ignores the audience. So too much of any good thing is bad. You don't want a paper like me, 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 right? Without taking into the account the audience that's reading your paper. So this can help by being communicative, right? Like we talked about, that kind of conversational quality. So some subjectivity is needed to understand who the writer is, or to hear the writer's voice leading the paper in a way so that you can really easily tell when the author's speaking and when they're using someone else's ideas to back up their assertions. When it comes to writing style and individuality, it's an important thing to discuss, as we all have a different style that comes from our preferences, our socialization, our level of education, and many other factors that create a genuine and unique voice. And I mean, to tangent, right? The FBI agent that developed the technique known as, linguistic forensics found the Unabomber this way, right? That's how they caught the Unabomber, was how he wrote. Specifically, Ted Kaczynski in letters to his family would say phrases like, eat your cake and have it too, instead of the more accepted version, have your cake and eat it too. Though he was technically right about that being the right way to say it. Not that most people are like, hey, let's defend the Unabomber. But that was pretty specific to him, the way that he wrote it. So there was certain words, the way he spelled it, things like that, that made it very clear to where they could actually develop an entire discipline, called forensic linguistics, to find ways to connect people to their writing to an individual, right? It's like pointing out to people how we call rigging elections when you choose your voters gerrymandering, but the dude who it's based on had the last name, it was actually Gary, so it should be called gerrymandering. But anyway, thanks for this exciting tangent journey with me. Anyway, what I was trying to say was, we all have a specific style in our writing, and it conveys things about us. So even in structured writing, you choose your words and your approach. So even in a research paper, your voice should still shine through. Okay, so concreteness, in my view, is one of the most important things to discuss, because you want to avoid vague ideas. When you have vague ideas in your paper, it's harder to understand your meanings, right? So you want to be clear with your meanings, and whether this is an issue of word choice, or maybe you're vague in how you're defining certain things, vague ideas make the reader fill in the blank for you. And when they do that, it's super easy for the reader to confuse your point or interpret it in a way that's different than how you intended. So lack of concreteness muddles and confuses your paper. And it can make it sound like you don't understand your topic, which obviously does not provide much credibility to it. Our ideas are based on our unique socialization, our experiences, our standpoints. So that is helpful to develop our voice, right? But we also need to have accessibility in our papers so we can help others understand what it is we're arguing and why it's an important issue or topic, why we're exploring that, and really kind of what I make you do in the conclusion section of your paper for this course. Why should this research be done and what should be done about it in the larger culture, right? How do we connect what we're studying to the actual social world we're living in, right? So we're not just being armchair sociologists, so we're actually, kind of being part of that understanding of building knowledge and really building social change.